The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Healthcare on the brink of collapse, community transmission widespread, a third of us not following the protocols much at all. Modeling from the Ministry of Health released yesterday showed that we are headed into some very tough times if we don't get our acts together. It all means hard questions ahead, including, are Ontario's guidelines for making life and death decisions on who gets medical treatment fair? We'll consider that tonight. Then, as they say, for something completely different, a new NHL season is just underway, and we'll hear from no-nonsense commentator and former Leafs president and general manager Brian Burke on his memoir of a life in and beyond hockey. It's Wednesday, January 13th, and that's next on the agenda. The province presented new modelling data yesterday, and the co-chair of Ontario's COVID-19 Science Advisory Table said, in the days ahead, doctors will have to make choices they don't want to make. Choices about who will get the care they need and who will not. What will guide doctors in those excruciating moments are triage protocols, which Ontario updated in December. With us now to consider the parameters for making such life and death decisions, particularly as they may apply to people with disabilities. We'll introduce our guests, as is our custom here, from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital with Dr. James Downer. He is the head of the University of Ottawa's Division of Palliative Care and a critical care physician at the Ottawa Hospital, who co-led the drafting of Ontario's crisis triage guidelines. In Kingston, Ontario, Udo Schucklenk, Ontario Research Chair in Bioethics and Professor of Philosophy at Queen's University. In the provincial capital in Parkdale, Mariam Shenouda, staff lawyer at the Arch Disability Law Centre. And in Midtown, David Lepofsky, chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance and a visiting professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School. And we're delighted to welcome all four of you back for an important conversation on TVO tonight. Just before we get to it, we thought it might be useful to have a short explainer on what crisis triage actually is. So Sheldon, why don't we start with that, if you would.
What is crisis triage? A crisis triage protocol is activated in the case of a public health emergency, such as a pandemic or natural disaster, when the demand for medical services dramatically exceeds the supply. A triage protocol is a set of guidelines to determine the allocation of limited medical resources during such an emergency. The principle of triage is to save as many lives as possible by prioritizing emergency treatment according to criteria often including the person's chance of survival or life expectancy. For example, under a triage protocol, it could be considered justifiable to remove an older, frailer patient from a ventilator in order to save a younger patient. When the priority of patients can't be made based on medical need, some triage protocols determine treatment by first come, first served, or lottery system.
Okay, thanks to Jan Jagannathan for that backgrounder. James Downer, let's start with you. How close, in your view, are we in the province of Ontario today to having to enact crisis triage protocols?
Well, we haven't enacted them yet, but I think it's fair to say that we are getting close. As of this morning, we had about 404 patients with COVID in our ICUs, but our total ICU census for the province is at a little over 1,800 right now. For comparison, a year ago, we didn't have, on any given day, I think even 1,700 beds available, and now we're caring for 1,800 patients. So we've definitely had to expand our capacity, and we're starting to feel the strain, particularly in some areas around the GTA and in the southwest of the province. It's important to note that the limitations are really probably not beds anymore or ventilators, but actually trained staff. You can buy ventilators, you can buy beds, and you can find space in a hospital. It's a lot harder to get trained and expert staff to manage critically ill patients in a short period of time. And I think that's more than likely going to be the limitation we hit, because of course many of our staff are starting to feel the strain themselves. the effects of the COVID pandemic through illness, burnout, or other problems, family considerations, that we're feeling a strain on our human resource capacity.
Okay, let me jump in with a quick.
Say we're not there yet, but we're not far.
Gotcha. Let me do a couple quick follow-ups with you, because people may be doing the math in their head right now, saying, okay, 400 patients right now, capacity for 2,100 in ICU. That feels like a big gap. So why would we be close?
Well, 2,100 would be the actual physical ventilators and bed spaces. And as I just mentioned, actually the limitation is probably not going to be ventilators and bed spaces, but rather staff. Plus the fact that we may have a big surge in one area of the province and not another. We're doing our very best to move patients around as quickly as we can. But that's not as fast a process as you might think. And the modeling data from that we all saw yesterday suggested that in a matter of weeks, we could be looking at 800 to 1,000 COVID cases, which, when you already are dealing with 1,200 to 1,400 cases of people being critically ill for other reasons, nothing to do with COVID, and that's not likely to go down substantially. The math is not complicated. We will just simply not have enough space for everybody.
Okay, some of you were on this program several months ago when we first tackled this topic. And James Downer, one more fast follow-up with you. The original triage protocols came out in March. They were rescinded in September. And you, as we suggested off the top, you're part of the sort of table of experts who tried to draft those protocols. How come they were withdrawn in September?
Well, so they were withdrawn with the idea that they were being replaced with a newer and sort of more updated guidance. The process is a sort of a process of continuous revision and improvement as we get more data and as we get more input. So, when wave one happened, it's important to remember that we saw all around the world, every other jurisdiction that was getting hit with COVID was being overwhelmed and going into triage scenarios. We had a very, very short period of time to get something ready to go. We got something out the door that was ready for use. Very fortunately, the flattening of the curve did occur. Our public health measures were effective, and we didn't have to use them. But the process was from the start. We refer to these as green documents, right? So they're always sort of constantly in growth and modification as we get more input, more helpful input, and more up-to-date data. And even if we were to have to use triage now, in the coming weeks and months, that document itself would not be considered, I think, final, or that approach wouldn't be the final approach. We would always be interested in a process of getting new information, updating and improving the document in any way that we can.
Okay, Mariam Shernuda, why don't you come in here at this point and tell us what your original concerns were with the original crisis triage protocols that came out 10 months ago?
Yeah, so there were several. Procedural and substantive. So procedurally, there was a lack of transparency. I of course hear what James is saying about it was a very rough time. We saw what was happening around the world. We wanted to make sure that doctors here didn't have to be put in the position that doctors in Wuhan and Italy and other parts of the world were experiencing. Another issue, though, was lack of consultation. And we are now in January 2021. We're in the midst of wave 2. The government has had 10 months to be more transparent, to hold these consultations. And, to James's point that it was supposed to be replaced, we don't know what it's been replaced with. The Ontario Human Rights Commission has written to the government and told them, please provide us with what has been distributed to the hospitals as of December. And we haven't gotten that opportunity to review that protocol. So we don't know what it's been replaced with. And there's still been a lack of consultation. There's still a lack of transparency. Substantively, and Steve, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but the tools that were implemented or advised to be used as a guide by doctors, like the clinical frailty scale, were of deep, deep concern to persons with disabilities.
Well, let me jump in there if I can, because that'll take me nicely to David Lepofsky. The clinical frailty scale that was just referenced. David, perhaps you could tell us what it is and what your concern with it was.
Okay, and I think I want to answer that with the question you asked, Dr. Downer, but with a much more direct answer. The protocol which Dr. Downer co-wrote and which was in place from March until the end of October was inherently and unjustifiably discriminatory against patients with disabilities. And eventually, after we finally got a chance over the summer to prove that and show that and demonstrate it to the government's advisory bioethics table, of which Dr. Downer is a member, even the bioethics table agreed that what they had earlier recommended was actually discriminatory unfairly against people with disabilities.
But have they fixed that now?
And well, only in part. They haven't. They took it away at one part, but they've actually left it in place in another part. So what is the clinical frailty scale? What that earlier protocol had included, and what the only thing we've seen lately still leaves dangling out there as a tool that can be used, among others, is basically says to decide which critical care patients needing life-saving critical care will be triaged in or out, will be allowed in or rationed out. This will depend on whether they have a progressive disease, and if so, whether they are incapable of doing some or all of 11 activities of daily living without assistance, like getting out of bed or shopping or doing their finances. And so for patients with disabilities, that means people with disabilities, take away your assistance and see if you can do it yourself. Well, that's a fundamental violation of basic human rights principles, much less is it a fair assessment of whether they are likely to live or die if treated. And so we pointed out that what the bioethics table and Dr. Downer had recommended last spring, and which the government left in place over months, was in fact discriminatory and pressured. Finally, the bioethics table agreed, and eventually the Ford government rescinded it. They should have done that 6 months ago.
Okay, let's get Udo Schucklink in here at this point, because we've got medical people, we've got advocates for disabled people here. We need a good bioethicist, and that's you. Tell us the tightrope that all groups are walking in a case like this, because we're dealing with some of the most, this isn't the right word, but you know what I mean, some of the most treacherous ethical considerations of life and death that are imaginable here. What's the mission?
Well, you're absolutely right. You got to ask yourself as a government or as people writing guidelines, what it is that you're aiming for? Because you find yourself in a situation that, our title today is Ontario's Crisis Triage Discriminatory? And the long and short of that is, of course it is, and it has to be discriminatory. It has to discriminate, for instance, say they have to make choices, for instance. They have to decide whether they make sure that somebody survives based on their life expectancy or on their quality of life, because they are not able to treat everybody. So for that reason, any triage protocol is discriminatory, because by virtue of the decisions that they make, they will always discriminate against somebody who then will die as a result of that decision. And the only reason why that is necessary is because they know at the outset that not everybody who needs care will be able to get that care. The question then is whether the decision that is being made, that is, in other words, the discriminatory decision that is being made, whether this discrimination is justifiable or not. And this is what David alluded to earlier. And he, of course, thought that the old protocol that I haven't seen, quite frankly, because it was so secretive, that this discriminated unfairly against disabled people.
Do you like the new protocols better?
I think the new protocol actually is pretty good, because, I wouldn't have written it that way, but I also don't think it's a terrible protocol, because here what they're doing essentially is they still try to preserve the maximum number of lives that they can preserve. And they have a sort of a rider on that. They're saying you need to ensure at least that somebody does not just survive, but survives at least for 12 months after the intervention. In health economics, for instance, when they talk about resource allocation decision-making and the ethics of that, they often aim for other things. They aim, for instance, for maximizing the number of life years that you can preserve, as opposed to just lives. So it wouldn't matter then whether somebody is 50 or 94, for instance, just to give you one example. Then the younger person would be, there would be discrimination in favor of that person.
James Downer, you've heard some of the criticisms and some of the support of your efforts so far. I should give you a chance just to comment on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, and again, I don't want anything I'm saying here to be taken as a personal criticism of anybody on the show or anybody else for that matter. I do think it's important, though, to just correct a few points in terms of procedure. We have been engaged in extensive consultation with many groups, including disability groups, including clinical groups, including groups representing Indigenous populations, many others. The list goes on. It literally hundreds of people over a matter of months to get input to go into this document. And the consultation certainly is by no means over. I think everyone's committed to an ongoing process of trying to refine and revise this in a positive way. So just to be very clear about that. The other thing that's important to say is that the bioethics table, I think at no point really said that they felt that the protocol or the document that we produced was unjustifiably discriminatory. What we are trying to do is that we have a number of principles and that we're trying to sort of balance here, right? That broadly speaking, it's the desire to save as many lives as possible, but also to be very procedurally fair and try to make sure that we're not, disproportionately affecting one population or another. And as you're trying to sort of defend human rights, but also protect human lives, trying to find the way to best balance that is hard. There's no one right answer.
Okay, can I ask you about one of them?
If I can, sure, go ahead.
Okay, because we just heard from Udo saying that the notion that you should be able to survive for at least 12 months after care is a consideration in how doctors will do their work. And I guess I just need to know what's magic about 12 months. How'd you land on that?
So the challenge here, right, is that you're trying to, I mean, when you're talking about saving lives, what do you mean? Like, there's many ways to capture the concept of saving lives. Are you trying to have the most people survive just to the point that you can get them off of life support? Well, nobody really thinks that that's the purpose of healthcare or critical care, is just to survive literally to the point that you make it to the ICU door. You're hoping to survive for at least some sort of period of time and make a recovery. But if you start to get out to 5 and 10 and 20 years, then it becomes implicitly ageist, right? That there are certain people who may, just because they're in an advanced age, would not have that many years to live, but it's not really about their mortality risk per se. So you're trying to find the balance between a protocol that talks about survival and recovery, and not get too far into ageism. It's not strictly speaking about who's going to live, how long any individual might survive. It's about mortality risk. So the purpose of these tools, and I'd like 2 minutes to talk about the tools if I can. The idea is that we're trying to create tiers of risk so that, and ideally, if we have enough resources, everybody gets the resources, right? Nobody is excluded from critical care under the protocol. The idea is that as the surgeon demand climbs, and we get to the point where we literally just do not have enough to go around, that we're sort of trying to focus our resources on the people who are most likely to benefit, people who are most likely to survive if they get critical care, but not survive if they don't. So that would be the benefit in that sense. But the idea that, is it 12 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 18 months? The idea is that the people who would be in those 4 risk groups, if you're looking at a 12-month risk of mortality, would be the same people in those 4 risk groups if you looked at 6 months or 18 months. The focus on the duration of time where you're looking at the data is not really a substantive concern, because whether you looked at their mortality at 6 months or 12 months, it would end up being the same individuals. We're just trying to say that, we have data, and a lot of the mortality prediction tools and clinical guidance that we're giving people is focused on data of mortality out to a year, because that in the public's literature is what we have.
Okay, I get you.
I'm going to come back to the clinical.
You know what? You got to forgive me, James Downer. I got to try to keep the time as equal here as possible. So let me get to Mariam on this next question. This is a real hard question, but this is all life and death stuff we're dealing with here today. Under what circumstances, in your view, should someone be pulled off a ventilator in order to give it to someone else? Because that's the scenario that many doctors and nurses are going to be looking at, potentially, if we don't flatten the curve.
Yeah. So, Steve, I have a real problem with examples like that, because what we're talking about, and this goes back to what Professor Truculence said and a little bit about what Dr. Downer said about this balance between ethical principles and the human rights framework. And they've been equated from the very beginning within this triage protocol. And that's problematic for several reasons. The first one is ethical principles are just that. They're principles. The human rights framework that we have are quasi-constitutional rights that are bestowed upon all of us. So you shouldn't be drafting a triage protocol to answer questions like the one you just posed by looking at ethical principles. You should be looking at a human rights framework. Second, the ethical principles that do guide this document are, some of them in and themselves, discriminatory. By way of examples, utilitarianism, which was mentioned at the top of the program and has also been mentioned by both Dr. Downer and Professor Shecklenk. Utilitarianism talks about the maximum benefit of good for the maximum number of people. The problem is that when we look at this, persons with disabilities hardly ever comprise that maximum group of people that have received that benefit. So the ends justifies the means, which pretty much is utilitarianism, will always be discriminatory to persons with disabilities.
But if you don't use that philosophy, what should you use?
The human rights framework. And the human rights framework talks about A, the duty to accommodate, and B, up to the point of undue hardship. It's not this idealistic idea of fairness. It's substantive fairness as set out in Section 15 of the Charter. So to dilute or to equate ethical principles with human rights framework is to dilute a very robust system. And just one more point on that, Steve, to say that we just don't have time, we're in a pandemic, we need to be efficient. This is the type of scenario where human rights matter the most. Human rights aren't triggered when things are easy and people are living a happy life. Human rights are especially triggered in these most dire of times, and we can't trample over them for the sake of efficiency and by trampling them by putting in ethical principles as taking primacy over human rights. I don't think that's appropriate.
Okay, Udo Schuckling, can I get your view on whether we should take a more human rights-based lens as we look at this issue versus a more philosophically utilitarian lens on this? What's your view?
Well, I'm biased here. I am a utilitarian, so I do care about outcomes. And that's the nature of healthcare systems. Healthcare systems always try to maximize human well-being. I have issues with the human rights argument because the truth is none of these charter rights are absolute. They can all be overridden, provided we have a good justification for that. So what the previous speaker has just done, basically, she has hidden behind human rights rhetoric, but she dodged the question. And the question remains. If you have somebody who is in a hospital setting, and I worked many years ago in South Africa, so I've actually seen this as a clinical ethics person, like I was on the bedside. And you find yourself in a situation that there's a patient there that is on a ventilator, has not a really good outlook in terms of survival, and there's somebody else who needs access to that ventilator. And you know that this person with a much higher probability will be able to leave that hospital. Are you then going to, as the previous speaker has just done, no, we can't do this and we must not do this and outcomes apparently don't matter. It's all about rights. Are you really then saying, okay, we stand by, we wait for this person who could have left the hospital to die, and the other person is also going to die, but we certainly will not wean that person off the ventilator. Suffice it to say, in South Africa, of course they have weaned that person off the ventilator in order to save this other life.
David Lepofsky, you want to weigh in?
Dr. Downer and more significantly, Professor Schuckling may give you ideas from the point of view of bioethics. I'm sorry, but we live in a country that's governed by law and the rule of law. And some of what Dr. Schuckling just took as utterly acceptable would, I think, need to be explained. Someone need to explain to me why it is not culpable homicide under our criminal code. And you can't... Even underlying all of this discussion has been even this implicit premise that somehow the government can send a memo to hospitals deciding who lives and who dies without any proper legal authority. Now, the bioethics table in its most recent writing has suggested a greater recognition that we need to have a legal support. But I'm telling you categorically, any doctor who does what Professor Schuckling just said, without legal authority, better be consulting a lawyer and fast. This is not a question of philosophy first. The law prevails. Second, Dr. Shuckling's understanding of the way the Charter of Rights and Human Rights works, I'd respectfully suggest is fundamentally and severely flawed. And I know this stuff, I teach it, I've practiced it for decades. And let me just address a couple of other points. Dr. Downer said, oh, there's been lots of consultation. Yes, last summer and fall, or last summer, we had discussions with the bioethics table. It's an external advisory body that advises the government. We have not been able to have one word of conversation with anybody in the Ministry of Health who's actually making the decisions. They have refused to talk to us. The Minister of Health has refused to answer any of our 6 letters with our most basic inquiries. The image you got from Dr. Downer of, oh, this is also consultative. Yeah, the external human shields, the bioethics table are out there talking to us, but the people making the actual decisions aren't. And why that's significant, Steve, is because the one time we heard 2 minutes from somebody who's actually a member of the government's internal body called their Critical Care Command Center, a Dr. Andrew Baker, on a conference call that we had to give our input a couple of weeks ago, he took a position or an approach which is at odds with the bioethics table's recommendations, and I fundamentally believe at odds with our Human Rights Code and our Charter of Rights. I'm happy to go into it if we have time.
Well, no, David, forgive me. I wish we did. Unfortunately, we don't, and I really need to let Udo respond to the comments you just made. So go ahead, Udo.
No, actually, I wanted to just say that we have common ground with regard to the status of this document, because I'm just like you, completely puzzled about it. When you look at the charter that this bioethics table itself has, it's very clear that these documents themselves are meaningless until government adopts it, whether they do it in form of legislation or by some other means, and then you can sue over this. I understand all of that. But right now, at least, that document has no standing until it is adopted by government. It's just the opinion of this table. And the table itself makes very clear that this is how it understands itself. It basically provides government with these sorts of guidance document, and government then has to decide what to do with that. But prior to that, that document has no standing, and it shouldn't, of course.
And even under it, each doctor, we take issue with the 12-month timeline. We think it's too long. We take issue with the lack of due process. The document recommends more than there was before, but patients deserve an independent legal safeguard when their very right to life is at risk. And we take issue with the fact that, in effect, under the document that we are now talking about, which is the one the government circulated after repeated pressure and questions in the legislature, not before, each doctor assessing each patient would ultimately be a law unto themselves, applying no clear standards with rampant room for subjectivity and therefore serious risk of bias, including discrimination against people with disabilities that they may not even be aware they're doing.
David, let me jump in here because we're down to our last few minutes, unfortunately, and because you are visually impaired, you could not see Dr. Downer shaking his head in the midst of that answer. Dr. Downer, you want to push back on that?
On a few points. Right off the bat, I just think it's really important to note that the purpose of these clinical tools are that they would be applied to specific medical conditions for which they are relevant for predicting mortality. There's only one eligibility and prioritization. There's only one prioritization criteria we use, and that's mortality risk. So references to things like the clinical frailty scale are meant to apply only to people who have frailty, not to all individuals with disabilities, chronic disabilities, people who are younger than 50. These are people for whom the clinical frailty scale is not prognostic. And that's been very clear, I think, from a very early stage here. And we've tried to communicate that. You don't apply clinical frailty scales outside the people who have frailty, the same way you wouldn't use our cancer tools to prognosticate for somebody who doesn't have cancer, the same way you wouldn't use heart failure tools to prognosticate for people who have heart failure. I think it's also extremely important to note that, even in this sort of this notion of human rights imbue everything we do. We are human rights focused people. That is what we're about. All of us are trying to make a better system here. But the idea that we're sort of sacrificing human rights, I just don't think is correct. The purpose of having clear, explicit criteria is that they are the antidote to implicit biases. They are the antidote to subjective judgments, is to put clear clinical tools out there that enables people to have a standard against. Just let me finish, David. I didn't interrupt.
Sure.
That there are clear standards that people can apply consistently, that they're standardizing mortality risk so that somebody with heart failure can be compared to somebody with cancer, can be compared to somebody who comes in following a car accident. And we're trying to treat everybody as fairly as possible. And again, we don't want to restrict access to anybody. We would love it if we could simply offer critical care to every single person. The notion, though, that there's this sort of pushing aside of human rights. Some of Canada's foremost rights lawyers, that Jocelyn Downey wrote an editorial saying that our Ontario protocol should be adopted nationwide. Our protocol has been served as the inspiration for similar protocols that were accepted with enthusiastic support of disability groups in Quebec. It's been adopted in Israel.
I got you. I'm down to a minute and a half, though, and I want to give David Lepofsky a chance to respond.
Dr. Downer conceded in conversations with us at his bioethics table consultation that the clinical frailty scale, which he is the passionate defender of, includes subjective calls by doctors.
Don't they do that every day anyway, David?
Well, not when you're doing objective assessments. The point is, don't tell us that it is an objective requirement when it is a subjective one. Each doctor will be a law unto themselves. And not only that, but when I asked Dr. Downer last summer during these consultations about how doctors make palliative care assessments, whether you've got 3 months to live to qualify. Now that's the situation of deciding if you get into palliative care, not whether you get critical care. But Dr. Downer said that doctors lie. Now, he's not meaning lie, and I don't believe in a nasty sense. He's saying that essentially, if I understand correctly, they will say what they need to say to get the person in. But that's the same kind of subjective risk we're facing here when you change 3 months to 12 months. So
okay, I got to give him 30 seconds to respond to that.
Absolutely.
Dr. Downer, finish it off.
What I said was that when there's scope for and the ability to use judgment, that physicians sometimes will give prognoses that are shorter for the purpose of getting them more resources in a home care setting. This is physicians using their discretion to get more resources for their patients because they're advocating for their patients. That was what I said very clearly to you, Mr. Lepofsky. They're not lying to suit their own needs or for their own convenience. And that's a very, very important distinction, Mr. Lepofsky.
Okay, friends, forgive me. I got to jump in. We need you four back for another program. I'm grateful to James Downer, Udo Schuckling, David Lepofsky, Mariam Shenouda for joining us on TVO tonight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much.
When you think of the men who have been general managers of the National Hockey League's now 32 franchises, here's what I'm betting. I'm betting you don't think graduates of Harvard Law. I'm betting you don't think they tell their billionaire owners there's going to be two hands on the steering wheel here and they're both mine or I'm out of here. And I'm betting you don't think that they're world leaders in encouraging respect and acceptance of openly gay athletes. That's why tonight's guest is so different. Yes, Brian Burke was a Stanley Cup champion manager with the Anaheim Ducks. But as we suggested, he's so much more than that. And he chronicles it all in his new bio, co-authored with Stephen Brunt. It's called Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey, and it brings Brian Burke to our airwaves tonight from the provincial capital. Brian, it's good to see you again. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. I would like to start in Minnesota, where you moved as a young kid, and I wonder whether you ever think about the fact that had you not moved there and therefore fallen in love with hockey, because it is such a hockey hotbed, how different your life might have turned out.
Yeah, I don't know. The fact of the matter is I fell in love with the game in Minnesota. We moved there when I was 12. I saw the state high school hockey tournament on television because we got stuck in a motel for a couple of days. And I fell in love with the game and I started playing that next year. And had I not moved there, I was a football and baseball player when I lived in Boston before I moved there. I probably would have stuck with those sports. As it was, I played football through high school in Minnesota, but hockey was my true love, and hockey has given me everything in my adult life. So I shudder to think what might have happened if I hadn't gone that route.
Well, you famously described the kinds of teams that you like to manage as pugnacious, with truculence and belligerence, and I wonder how well those adjectives describe you when you played the game.
Well, I wasn't a big fighter. If you look at my stats, you can't lie about stuff like that because players that you played with will call you out right away. So I wasn't a big fighter. I don't know how many times I fought that year, 6, 7, which is probably a big fighter in today's day and game, but back then, 6 or 7 fights were nothing. And so I wasn't a big fighter, but I fought some tough guys, and I was not afraid. I fought 4 teammates when I had to. So to me, I was a big hitter. I played 4 years of college hockey. You're not allowed to fight. I had 1 fight in 4 years and got kicked out for a game for it. So, but I played hard. I don't think I have to apologize to anyone for the way I played.
Do you know, incidentally, that you are one of 3 Brian Burkes who played organized hockey at a high level?
No, I did not know that.
You are. Yeah, there was one Brian Burke who coached at Mercyhurst College, and Brian Burke who played 4 years for the Notre Dame Hounds in Western Canada. So I guess you've never met those guys.
There was a Brian Burke that played. I'm trying to think. There was a Burke that played at Notre Dame. I think the same time University of Notre Dame. The same time that I played at Providence. I think there was a Brian Burke, but I met him once, and I know famously years ago, someone said in the media in Toronto that if my team made the playoffs, he would shine my shoes. And we made the playoffs. And he went on the radio and said, anyone named Brian Burke, come down to the studio and I'll shine your shoes. And 3 people showed up. One was Trevor Linden's barber, if you can believe it. Huh. One was some random guy who said, I want to thank Brian Burke. I always get the best table when I make a reservation. And then a third random guy. So it's a Burke is not an uncommon Gaelic name. And Brian's not an uncommon Gaelic first name.
Right on. Does it bother you? I don't think you addressed this in the book, but you tried really hard to get as far as you could in hockey, and you had a decent university career in hockey, but you never did play 1 game in the NHL. Does that bug you?
It used to bug me. I think I have to focus on where I started and how far I got. So my 10th year of organized hockey. So for the average guy, he starts 5 or 6 years old. His 10th year of organized hockey, he's 16 and he's playing whatever. My 10th year of organized hockey, I was playing in the American Hockey League. So I focus more on how far I got and how fast I got there rather than that I came up short. So people have said to me, I've been teased about it. When people say, oh, you never played in the show. And I'm like, yeah, and you've never played in the American Hockey League. And if you'd gone back and seen me play when I was first starting out and where I got to, I'm content. I paid for most of my college education with a scholarship, and I managed to turn pro with the Philadelphia Flyers. I'm content with what I accomplished in the game.
One of the singular influences in your life has been a guy by the name of Lou Lamoriello, who was your coach at Providence College when you played university hockey, and who still, at the age of 78, is managing a National Hockey League team, the Islanders. What, in your view, and of course he's a Stanley Cup champion as well, what, in your view, makes Lou so great?
Well, I think his commitment to excellence, like everything he does, he's a very intense guy. So everything he does is calculated toward being successful at something. So how you dress, how you act. Like when I played for him, it wasn't just about hockey. It was about turning a green kid from Minnesota like me into a man. And it was a lifestyle thing. It was a commitment to a way of life. And Lou impresses that on you right away, that everything we do here, whether it's New Jersey Devils or New York Islanders, Toronto Maple Leafs, is going to be with an eye toward having a parade. And that intensity wears off on you as a player. It infuses the team. As a player, you pick up on that right away, your practice habits, your game habits. So I think it's his intensity, his attention to detail. But he's, how old, 78? He'll be doing it. He'll be doing it until I carry him out of there.
Another huge influence in your life was Pat Quinn, originally from Hamilton, Ontario, who hired you to be his assistant general manager in Vancouver. He taught you that gentlemen wear French cuffs on their shirts. He was a big, tough Irishman, and there you are doing it, still modeling Pat Quinn. Well, that was the question, really. How much of Brian Burke is modeled after Pat Quinn?
Well, I hope a lot. I hope the good stuff that I learned from Pat. Pat was a great man and a great teacher and a very patient guy. And he was much more patient than I am. He's a better listener than I am. But he was fair. Pat used the word fair all the time. He said, I don't owe you to make you rich. I don't owe you to give you a certain title. I owe you fairness. He was big on fairness to players, coaches, trainers, everyone. He wanted them to feel like they were being treated fairly. And I wanted to be Pat Quinn. I say that in the book. Like a lot of us did. A lot of young executives said, I want to be like Pat Quinn, this reputation for honesty and frankness and fairness. Clearly a towering intellect, law school graduate, and got his degree the hard way, like going part-time in between jobs and okay, I went to Harvard Law School. Everyone's impressed with that. I'm more impressed with my son, Patrick, who went to the New England School of Law, but went part-time and worked full-time for the Flyers while he got his law degree. I just took myself out of the workplace for 3 years. Pat chipped away at his and did it the hard way, so I respect that.
I want to take you now to the time when you were the general manager of the Vancouver Canucks. And again, we have basically a non-sports audience here that's probably watching this right now. So I'd like you, if you would, to explain to them what massive steps you undertook in order to be able to draft second and third, back-to-back, in order to get the Sedin twins, something that essentially is unprecedented in the history of the game.
Well, I never talk about the Sedins. First off, I want to mention Stephen Brunt, who tells this tale so wonderfully, who was my partner in the book, who did a great job. But the two guys that deserve the most credit for the Sedins are Thomas Gerdin, who was our Swedish scout at the time, and he believed in these kids long before I did. And then Mark Crawford, the coach that had them when they first came in and turned them into players. They deserve the heroes' worship here in terms of the deal. Thomas Gerdin came to me and said, we got these twins coming up. We've got to find a way to draft them both. And I said, what are you, smoking dope? No one's picked second and third or first and second or third and fourth in the draft. No one's ever done it. And so it was like, it's crazy. Then I saw them play at the World Juniors, and they weren't that good. The World Juniors that year were in Winnipeg, and the Twins finished second and third in scoring, but they got all their points against Bulgaria and Greece and countries like that, right? Against the U.S. and Canada, when it counted, they didn't do anything, and they got knocked down a lot. So I left the World Juniors. I told our scouts I'm trading the pick. We knew we were going to have a very high pick, and that breaks your heart because the scouts worked so hard for those 2 days. But I said I'm trading the pick. Then Thomas Gerdin called me. The Twins were picked to play in the World Championships, which is a men's tournament. Even to this day, kids do not go to that tournament, 18-year-olds, very rarely. And they were picked for the tournament. And he said, well, you come over to Oslo and watch them play. And I was not going to the World Championships that year, but I said, okay, I'll go. And I went over and watched them play. And you could see right out of the gate, their very first game, second and third shift, that twin thing. So you'd see an open patch of ice. Hank would throw the puck into this open patch of ice. There's no one within 20 feet of it. And Danny would skate right onto it. And you saw this connection they had. And that's where I said, we got to get him. And that's where the work started.
They were spectacular together, but here's the bigger question. Could you actually tell the two of them apart?
No, not the first. I can tell them apart now, but I need a good hard look at them. Like if they're 10 feet away and walking toward me, I can't tell them apart. They got to be like 6 feet away. And then I can tell them apart. But the first year, Danny Sedin got a cut in his upper lip. He got 6 stitches in his upper lip. And we were all ecstatic. We're like, yes, he's going to have a scar and we'll be able to tell him apart. And the scar faded almost immediately. So we were all disappointed.
Okay. Your first coach in Vancouver was Mike Keenan. And you guys, how do I put this? You did not exactly hit it off. And you said this to Mike after one game in which he did something highly unusual. And I'll read an excerpt from the book here as it's described. You said to him, if you ever pull a goalie again in the middle of a game other than on a delayed penalty, I'm going to come down to the bench to beat you within an inch of your life in front of the crowd and the players and everyone else. I'm going to throw you down the hallway. I'm going to coach the rest of the game myself, and I'm going to fire your ass as soon as it's over. How did Mike take that when you said that to him?
Well, I think Mike expected a pretty adverse reaction. So we were playing at Maple Leaf Gardens, and he pulled the goaltender in the first period. And Mike was trying to make a point. Pavel Bure was holding out, and Mike was trying to make a point to me. You got to make this trade. Get me some players I can use that we can win some of these games that we're losing. And I thought it was a very poor way to do it, but he certainly made his point on me. It was like he told the whole world, we need players. And if we have to play short, we have to pull the goalie to get enough players out there to win, I'm going to do it. It didn't happen after that. After that brief conversation I had with Mike about it, it never happened again.
Brian, I think it's fair to say that you have a very strong personal code, which is well known around the game. And you're not the kind of guy who, if a player comes in to share something deeply personal with you, you're not going to kiss and tell, and those stories are not in the book. But your really poor relationship with Keenan clearly did make the book. How come you wanted to put that in?
The test for what went in the book was this discord or this issue, whether it was with Pierre Maguire or Kevin Weeks or Mike Keenan, was it widely known around the team at the time? In other words, could you have heard this story, Steve, at a bar from one of my other players or from one of the other coaches? And the answer is yes. So there's not one story used in the book that teammates and coaching staff weren't widely aware of. So that was the test. I didn't air anyone's dirty laundry out here. I didn't throw anyone under the bus. I don't respect people that do that in books, but I did put in some story. To me, it's not typical for a GM to be feuding with his coach like that. It's not typical for players to be feuding among one another. It's not typical for the GM to be feuding with the owner. The most complex stories I put in there were me and ownership to show that here's what I told Stephen Brunt. I wanted people, well, first off, anyone who bought the book, I want you to enjoy it. Like, I would be sick to my stomach if I thought someone spent $25 on a book and didn't like it. So number one, I wanted it to be a good read that people would enjoy. But number two, and I think Stephen Brunt did this really well, I wanted people to feel like they were sitting in my office or sitting on the draft floor with me as I did the deal for the Sedins. And that's why there's so much detail in there. Like, every single detail of that trade is in there. And then I went back and showed it to Dave Nonis, who was my right-hand man at the time, my assistant GM, and said, is this accurate? I don't want to tell a story that's not accurate. I went back on all of these things where I could fact check with a contemporaneous, someone who was with me contemporaneously. I went back and checked it. So there's no stories in there that would expose someone to something that wasn't already widely known on that team.
I want to take you back 8.5 years to the last time you were on this program. You came into the studio back then, thankfully no COVID at the time, and you were working for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and hopes were extremely high. And we talked about the mission that you were on. And here's a little snippet from that interview. If trading guys who are under difficult personal circumstances is the worst part of the job, what's the best part of the job?
Winning is the best part of the job. When you have a parade, you win it all. It's like climbing Everest in our profession. You got 30 GMs trying to do it. You got all these players trying to do it, and your group managed to climb to the peak and plant that flag, and there is nothing in your professional life that's going to touch it.
How much do you still think about the fact that you could have been as immortal as they come had you been able to have a parade in Ontario's capital city?
Yeah, first off, I wish I looked that young today as I did in that old. I mean, I didn't get the job done here. So the fact of the matter is, and I think accountability is vanishing in society. I think it's fashionable to blame other people. And when I got fired by the Leafs, I said, on a day in which accountability is fast vanishing in Canada, I intend to be accountable. I didn't win enough games. Now, the team got sold. That's why I got hooked in Vancouver. The inexplicable fire was Vancouver. My team had 100 points and I got fired. The team got sold. That's what happens. And the team got sold here, and I believe they were going to make a change no matter what. But if we'd been in first place, they could not have made a change. So I'm not going to cop out and say, oh, the team got sold. The fact of the matter is, had I won more games, I'd probably still have kept my job even when the team was sold. But it wasn't for lack of effort. It wasn't for lack of putting together a good staff. And I think finally, when I did get fired, that was a playoff team. And that team did make the playoffs with virtually unchanged from when I got fired. And I look at the team I left in Vancouver with minor changes, played in the finals a few years after I left. After I left Vancouver in '92, they played in the finals in '94. So I think I've had a positive impact on teams. I think I've made a number of good trades and draft picks and put them in a better position to succeed. But the fact of the matter is, in pro sports, you don't win, you get fired. I didn't win enough games in Toronto. I got fired.
Did you ever, in your view, get a satisfactory explanation from upper management in Toronto as to why you were fired from here?
Well, the only two reasons they gave me that day were they said that I didn't use the financial muscle of the Leafs to their maximum advantage. And that was those backdiving contracts and big signing bonuses. And I thought there were cap circumventions, so I said, no, I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. And then second, they criticized the fact that I didn't get Roberto Luongo. But my efforts to get Roberto Luongo, the price tag was so steep that it didn't make any sense. So I said, okay, if today's a good day to make this change. If you think you're going to give me advice on player personnel decisions, it's a good time to move on.
Brian, you talk about this in the book, and so let's go here now. I'm going to ask you to do something that's really, really difficult, and that's talk about the son of yours, who, as we sit here taping this, about a week from now, would have turned 32 years old. Instead, you lost him when he was 21 to a car accident. I'm talking, of course, about Brendan, who courageously came out to you and to the public. And I want to read just an excerpt of a letter that you publish in the book from another father. And the letter goes like this. Mr. Burke, he writes, I was driving my son back to university in Guelph, and suddenly he said, pull over here at this liquor store. I thought that was odd because my son doesn't drink. He said, Dad, I'm gay. The thought that went through my mind in that moment is that if it's good enough for Brian Burke, it's good enough for me. So I said, no problem. You have no idea how you helped me with this. Brian, what's it like to get letters like that?
Well, there are fewer and farther between now. Right when this all happened, so Brendan came out, was very public, went on national television. He had the full support of our family and the hockey community, and then died not long afterwards, unfortunately, in a car accident in a blizzard. And I got thousands of letters like that. I'm not exaggerating. And then, right after the first few years, and then now I've left the Leafs, I'm harder to find, but I still do get the odd letter, or even people stop me on the street sometimes and tell me, I never thought I'd get a chance to tell you personally, but my son came out, and the way you dealt with it so lovingly enabled me and my family to deal with it. So this is why, if you notice, I sleep out for Covenant House. And I don't do a lot of work on behalf of the homeless. I've got my own charities, and that's where I spend my time. But I sleep out on behalf of Covenant House because 40% of their youth members are LGBTQ kids that have been kicked out of their house. So to me, Brendan continues to affect lives, to affect decision-making, to influence families, to help young people that need to come out, and his work continues.
There almost surely are gay players in the National Hockey League. How far? There are. Okay. How far away do you think we are to the point where they would feel comfortable publicly acknowledging that?
Well, you know what? I will tell you this. My work with the LGBTQ community has taught me one thing, and people will say what you just said, but they phrase it differently, Steve, and they say comfortable coming out, or they say, when will someone have the courage to come out? And that infuriates me, because if you talk to people in the LGBTQ community, what stops people from coming out normally, not always, but many, many times, I'd say the vast preponderance of times, is a close family member whose approval they're worried about. So your dad might say, if it's a parent, that's number one. Dad says, I got no use for gay people. God didn't intend for there to be gay people. Gay people are going straight to hell. Well, it's real hard to come out to that parent. And if you do, you've got to take some stuff back as the parent. You've got to walk some stuff back, which is not easy to do when you've tried to rip your son or daughter's heart out. So that's number one. But if it's not a parent, your dad's brother, your aunt, your uncle, someone close to you, a sibling that just can't abide the thought of having a gay sibling. That's what prevents the coming out. It's not about courage. It's about, I don't want to disrupt and maybe tear apart my family. And that's the awful choice that these kids are left with sometimes. And it's sad and it's wrong. So to me, we have gay players. There's no question in my mind. There's 700 players in the NHL. You take the expert statistics, whether it's 3% on the low end or 7% on the high end, whatever it is, we've got gay players. And my message to them is, you will find a very welcoming environment if and when you decide it's appropriate for you to come out.
Now, you could have said that when you were managing a team. You're not managing a team anymore. Can you really make that commitment on behalf of the other GMs in the game today?
I'm going to jump so hard on anyone that doesn't toe that line that, yes, I can make that commitment. I'll make life miserable for anyone that doesn't toe that line.
Okay, understood. Brian, let's finish up on this. Of all the people I've ever talked to, you definitely are the one who seems to care the least whether you are liked. And it's almost a badge of honor with you. Why do you think that is?
I think I learned this from Pat. My dad and mom taught me this too. Just if you're in the right, it's okay to be on an island if you're in the right. Even if you're standing completely alone, if you're in the right, it's okay to be on an island. And don't be popular, be right. Do the right thing, don't do the popular thing. So I came by it naturally from an early age. But it was distilled with Pat Quinn, because Pat truly, I remember one time I was really upset, something Tony Gallagher wrote. It's my first year in Vancouver, 87, 88. And Tony was hard on the team. And I went into Pat's office. He said, "What's bugging you?" And I said, "This is Tony Gallagher. I'd like to beat the snot out of him." Pat said, "Sit down." And he said, "This is going to eat at you. You can only care about what your family and close friends." He said, "The group of people you care about, you should be able to count on your fingers and toes. And anyone that's not on that list, you don't care what they say. You don't care what they think. You don't care what they feel. You've got to become impervious to this." And that day, a light went off in my brain that day, whereas I said, I don't care, and I truly don't. And the examples in the book, Steve, I'm sure you saw it. My ex-wife used to go nuts because I'd speak publicly and someone would come up, always, every time I speak, someone comes up and goes, "I have never liked you. I have never liked you. 20 years I've been watching on TV. I hate your guts, but I heard you speak today and I think you're an all right guy." Now there's a chance to make a friend, right? You just shake their hand and say thank you. What I say to them is, I didn't care what you thought yesterday, and I certainly don't care what you think today. It's so condescending to me, like, "Oh, I used to think you were a jerk, but now I like you. Get out of here."
Yeah, but you know Jennifer was right. You could just shake the guy's hand and say thanks.
Yeah, I could. It'd be too easy.
Brian Burke, you are nothing if not authentic. I got to give you that. And I got to tell you how much I just loved reading Burke's Law. Of course, the title taken from an old TV show that Gene Barry was in maybe 50 years ago. Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey. It has brought Brian Burke to our airwaves tonight. Great talking to you again, sir, and I hope we get to do it again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, January 13th, 2021. Could the kind of violence that took place at the U.S. Capitol last week be brewing here? Tomorrow, we'll look for signs of such trouble. Also, we'll explore the disturbing history of the Ku Klux Klan in Canada. That's right, in Canada. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.